Right, greetings, hello. Dr. Thomas Daffern here for my Christmas Eve talk at the Philosophy Club here in Betete. And we're continuing with our study of new religious movements, which in the periodic table are the grey boxes. And it's a very interesting field, actually, new religious movements. It's a new thing that's come up. I mean, even the field of religious studies is fairly new. I have histories of the discipline of religious studies. It's only about 100 years old. The first chairs at Oxford, Harvard, Chicago, in Germany and so on, were only really about 100 years ago. But new religious movements is taken even longer, because most of the professorial chairs of religious studies were originally affiliated to a particular brand of usually Christianity. There are religious studies chairs in Jewish universities and some Islamic universities, but they're seldom compared to the Christian universities, who were rather reluctant to see this thing called new religious movements established as a field of study, because it implies that they're old religious movements, and it implies a certain valuation. I mean, if religion X is the fundamental truth, then what do you need new religious movements for? So anyway, there was some delay in getting the field launched, and even now it's a minority flavour. Very few professors of religious studies actually look at new religious movements, although I do, and I've met some of the leading colleagues in the world that do, and they are very interesting. So that's why they've got their own brand, so to speak. And there's about 20 of them. We're running through them. And today we're going to be looking first at what's called New Thought, which is the box number 100 in the periodic table here. New Thought is like the quintessence of new religious movements in a sense, because it implies a whole new way of thinking. It emerged as a label in the 19th century, largely initially in the USA, which was, after all, a nation just recently founded in the late 18th century. And it was premised on the idea that they're going to find a new way. They're going to pioneer a scientific way, a new spirit of openness. The founders of the USA, people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, were great intellectuals who wanted America to be a haven for freedom of thought. A lot of the people that populated the USA had been refugees from religious intolerance. And so they'd gone to America to escape that. That included Quakers, Puritans, some Catholics, some Jews, and so on. So they made it like a founding part of the faith of the country, that there would be no religious persecution. It took them a while to realise that that should include Native Americans and their right to their own faiths. That took a while to kick in. Eventually, anyway, the American people sort of reached out for new thinking, and some of the founding thinkers of what's called New Thought were Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a famous philosopher in New England. He was studying at Harvard University Divinity School, but he dropped out because he couldn't agree with the fundamental tenets of Christianity. He thought, fascinating though they are, the Gospels are lovely, but that's nearly 2,000 years ago. We need like a new way of looking at them. We can't go on beating ourselves up about this event of the crucifixion, or pinning all our metaphysical hopes for every tribe of history on those sequence of events. So he wanted to put the teachings of Christianity in a new philosophical matrix. And so did other people around at that time in New England, but I'll use him to explain the core idea. Up until the advent of New Thought, most people who reflected on the matter felt that God was a kind of invisible spiritual being that is not part of this world, so transcendent that the very least we can do is sort of say a few prayers, and if he's lucky he might get the message, or if we're lucky, rather. But he's very, very far distant from us. So some people have therefore turned to radical humanism. They've rejected the whole idea of God and said, look, God's an old-fashioned idea, let's get rid of the idea. Some people have turned to materialism, like the Marxist tradition and the atomist tradition in European philosophy, which said, well, we don't need God to explain how the heart works or blood flows or even how the neurons work. Let's study the human being as humanist scientists, and we don't need to invoke God. And obviously material science was moving on apace in the 19th century with that hypothesis. Emerson said a different thing. He said, and he'd studied deeply German philosophy, so he was steeped in Goethe and Kant. He'd also studied English philosophy. He knew Coleridge, he knew Wordsworth and other people. He came to England and wrote a book about what he found among them. It's a very interesting book called English Traits, well worth reading. I have my grandfather's edition from the 1920s, actually. And Emerson said, why don't we do something different? Why, instead of saying God is out there, up there, an invisible spirit, or God doesn't exist, let's say God is the spirit within the human heart, the human mind. What if the God force is actually hiding inside all of us as our supreme consciousness? What if our highest mind is that God force? Now, most of the time we're not in touch with it. You know, we go through the motions of the day and life, stumbling on from one thing to another, doing our work, and we don't have time to allow that God spirit to manifest or come out. But Emerson said, what if it's there lurking inside us all along anyway, and occasionally we touch into it, like in moments of deep meditation, or in moments of deep conversation with a trusted friend, or in moments of a loving relationship with your partner. Those are moments when the God energy maybe manifests and reveals. Emerson called this the oversoul. There's the individual soul, and then there's the oversoul. And this was the beginning of new thought, because it was new in that it stopped looking at God in this sense of God's out there, away, something you either believe or don't believe in, but really it's got very little to do with us. Emerson and his similar thinkers, they were called the New England Transcendentalists, and they included Thoreau, who was an influence on Gandhi, because Thoreau took the idea even further. He said, okay, if God is in everyone, then, you know, there shouldn't be slavery, because God is in you, whatever your colour of your skin. And also, there shouldn't be such extremes of rich and poor. There shouldn't be class oppression and violence. So we should work to a more egalitarian society. And he founded the traditions of non-violent resistance to oppressive and unjust governments. He said, it's your duty I have as much right as a droplet of God to protest, you know, some evil Putin or Hitler or something as anyone. And I have as much responsibility to do that. So that was the that was the political application of New England Transcendentalism, which Thoreau spearheaded. After Emerson, other people took it in a more, well, they really drilled down deeply into this thing about this inner spirit. One of the most famous was Mary Baker Eddy, who was from Boston, also in New England. She founded what's called Christian Science, which is a branch of this new thought movement. She was a learned lady. Often these new religions are pioneered by women. She said we got it all wrong about Christianity, that it was precisely that power of the divine mind that Christ was tapping into. And if you reread the Gospels, when he says, you know, before Abraham was, I am, or if you just do this in my name, you will be healed. What he's saying is, if you contact that divine energy within yourself, you will be healed, because in your true nature, that's what Spirit wants for you, is to be well. So instead of lying around for 10 years, crippled and on a mat, waiting for charity, you know, when Christ came, he said, look, get up and get healed. That's a new thought thinker in a hurry to get people back on their feet. That was Christ. He was applying the spiritual current of that divine mind in action. But what Mary Baker Eddy was saying is that, you know, we are supposed to do the same. I mean, Christ wasn't there just saying, look at me, I'm great, I'm a Messiah, I can heal people. He was saying, look, these are the techniques, use them, live a good life, live a moral life, be loving to everyone, pray, and enter communion with that divine spirit, the Holy Spirit he called it, and then you'll be able to do such healings and similar things. And he even says in the Gospels, you'll be able to do even better than I can. So she took all that literally, and she then rewrote a commentary called The Key to the Scriptures, based on what she called Christian Science, because she said what she was saying is not different to science. Scientists want to look at phenomena truthfully, objectively, and in depth. So she said, let's apply this new way of thinking to the study of the Gospels and the entire Bible, but particularly the Gospels, and the book of Acts, which is full of healing experiences. And then we'll see, how is it done? And then we can practice it. So they started doing spiritual healing. And in the Church of Christian Science, people are trained, they do spiritual healing. And it made a big impression. Millions of people have been Christian Scientists ever since. I've known a few, quite important people. And then there was another figure, also very important, called Ernest Holmes, Holmes, like Sherlock. Not a relation, I don't think. But Ernest Holmes was the Sherlock Holmes of the mind, if you want. He wanted to find, he wrote this amazing book called The Science of Mind, which I have on the shelves here. And he explored in great detail, what was this oversoul? What is this divine mind? How do we find out about it? Where does it live in my being? And then what are the implications? So he teaches you how to contact the divine mind. And the key is humility. You can't sort of order and say, oi, divine mind, come into me. You have to be really quiet and in a sense you have to do what Muhammad called surrender. A good friend of mine, who's actually a Muslim girl, has just given birth to a son, little baby boy, a couple of days ago, actually for the winter solstice. I'm really happy for them, bless them. It's someone who visited here about a year ago. And I was thinking about, the child's absolute surrender, being born, and then as a baby, the mother cradles it, the father, it doesn't know how to walk, it can't eat. It's in a state of total surrender to life. And I was thinking that innocence of the child is like the state of Islam. It's a state of total surrender to reality. And we're all born into it. Each one of us starts as a little baby that's in a state of total surrender. And I can imagine what it's like to be born. I can sort of remember being born. It's a total state of surrender. You come out thinking, God, this is going to be exciting. I'm getting born again. But so that state of innocent, pure surrender is what Muhammad meant by Islam. He said we should return to that. Christ was saying the same thing when he said we should become like innocent children. We should lose all our trickery and our thievery and our immorality and just be as innocent as a little baby just being born. And so what Ernest Holmes said is that if we achieve that state, the divine mind itself will then find us a suitable abode to come and hang out with, because it's much older, much bigger than us individuals. We have the experience of our egos, which is the consciousness we've carried around ever since we were. Well, I can remember back to when I was about 3, at least. I can remember back to probably 2 in Montreal growing up. And I have some very early memories, like the first time I saw snow. And the consciousness that I am now is the same as the consciousness that I was when I was about 2 or 1. I can remember. It's still me, right? So that's got, a certain history, but that's just a tiny fragment of time compared to the divine mind, who's been around, it would appear, ever since the universe came into being. Certainly ever since this planet was formed, 4,000 million years ago. So if I can remember, a few decades, the divine mind can remember thousands of millions of years, and that's this one planetary life cycle. So what incredible layers of wisdom and insight would be embedded in that. And if we think of the divine mind as a caring and loving intelligence, it's wanting to sustain and create and like a mother, a newborn baby. So the divine intelligence wants us all to flourish, to grow, to be wise, to be happy, to be loved, and to be loving. What an awesome being that must be. So that's what Ernest Holmes, it's a guidebook to how to contact the divine mind. And the work he wrote is, there was a church of divine mind or divine science created. They call it the science of mind. And it's inspired a lot of people that, particularly in America, have set up their own churches. So you'll often find in most big cities, as well as the Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Islamic church, you'll find a science of mind church, where people will read Ernest Holmes and use that sort of new thought as a key to their own natural divine intelligence, actually. Another thinker that was inspired by this was a Scotsman called Thomas Troward, Troward, who was a lecturer. He'd spent many years in India. I think he was a medical doctor in India in the Victorian era, and he came back to Edinburgh and he gave these really brilliant lectures in comparative religion, and he espoused a variety of new thought in which he was saying, look, all the religions, all the branches of Hinduism, all the branches of Christianity and all the other religions, they come from this one fundamental insight into the fact there is a divine mind which is behind everything. And they're symbolic things like their statues, their prayers, their mosques, their particular types of prayer and so on. Those are all just techniques on how to contact that divine mind. A bit like a garage, where all the cars run on fuel. It doesn't matter what the brand is that you stop at the garage. It could be Texaco or Esso or some other brand of fuel, but it's the same stuff that powers all the cars. So that's what Thomas Troward said, and those were very influential lectures. Other New Thought thinkers, Charles and Mary Fillmore, who again lectured in the States and set up a sort of network, and also Joel Goldsmith. So this is quite an interesting tradition, and it's still alive today. It's alive on the internet. In their view, truth is always new. This idea of new thought, it doesn't mean that. It means that there's always bubbling up in every generation sort of new ways of looking at things. New thought is something we all should aspire to, and each generation does, in fact. So in the time of Christ, Christ and his apostles were the new thinkers of their day. And so that should be, that spirit of new thinking should be coming up again and again. So anyway, it's an interesting tradition. Now I estimate throughout the whole of history there have been about 100 million people who followed New Thought. I've based this on not just within modern 19th century and onwards Christianity, but also I think there are New Thought thinkers in other parts of the world. If you study Buddhism, if you study Shia Islam, if you study Sufism, there's New Thought type of thinking going on. The fundamental premise is that mind is the active creative power. So for instance, if I say I want a sip of tea, I think about it. Well, eventually I might reach out and have a sip of tea, but I have to think it first. That's just a very simple illustration, but if I want to build a house, I have to think it. I have to be an architect, design it, employ somebody. Anything I want to manifest, I think first, and then it comes into being. So the New Thought thinkers within all the religions say that God is that creative, inspirational first thought. What divine mind thought up the idea of stars? It's a good question. I'd love to get some new scientists and some New Thought people together, but invite them here to Betete and get a philosophy club going where we can ask astronomers to describe what actually happens when a star is forming. And the New Thought people can try and translate that into metaphysics, like what's the divine mind thinking of when that's happening. One thing I know is that it's about fusion. So when stars are formed, there's fusion of different elements going, and energy. And when stars power up, it's fusion energy of when atoms are coalescing in two hydrogen atoms coalesce and then become this new thing called helium. And in that, they release this tremendous energy. Now that sounds to me a bit like lovemaking. When two human souls coalesce and fuse, they create a third thing, a child. They create a new world. And in a sense, I think what the stars are doing is like what humans do in love. To me, the stars are lovemaking all the time. That's just a poet speaking. I can't explain it other way. But I think that if we, there are clairvoyants that say there are spirit beings in the suns and the stars. And that when you have a spiritual body, you can go and live in these planets. And I don't know, I suspend judgment. It's a nice idea. So that would be angels making love then in these different stars. God knows, but those are the sorts of things that if I'm a New Thought thinker, I'm allowed to think. And I can then do some scientific research about it. So things like the Scientific and Medical Network, which I belong to, we can try and design experiments. Rupert Sheldrake, who's a friend of mine, he's this kind of New Thought scientist. He has he's done lots of research on consciousness being far more than just what seems to be in the brain, according to brain scans. For instance, cats and dogs know when their owners are coming back, even if they're just 400 miles away. The minute the car turns around and the owner starts coming home, the cat goes meow and knows the owner's coming back 400 miles away, and the dog. And this has been filmed and recorded and proved. So these dogs and cats are tuned into the owner's consciousness, like beyond normal explanation. Now, he gave a lecture a couple of years ago about people that look at the sun can make the sun come out from a cloudy day. So if you look up in the sky and you really want the sun to appear, you look hard enough and say, sun, come out. The sun comes out. It's as if, I mean, he was slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I don't know. It was as if he was saying that we humans can be so in touch with the sun that the sun will, appear for us. And he claims that he's got documented evidence of this actually happening. And, well, he said actually, slightly tongue-in-cheek, said we could test for this, couldn't we? We'd get 100 people around the planet, winning the sun to come out, and then, see how often it works. Because we all have personal experience of that. I mean, I often wander around on a dull day and think, oh, I wish the sun would come out, and then suddenly there's a lovely beam of light appears. I think all of us have experienced that. But what would be interesting, says Rupert, is let's actually do that scientifically and have 100 volunteers doing it at the same time and see if it works always. Because if so, it tells us the sun may be conscious. The sun may be aware that somebody who loves it wants it to shine. I don't know, I suspend judgment, but the New Thought people would be happy with this. That's their sort of thing. And also a lot of movies are inspired by this. A lot of the sort of spiritual type movies that Hollywood makes, a lot of the Hollywood people are all New Thought people. And the fundamental message of Hollywood is, don't despair, think positively, you can do it. If you think it, it can happen. And that's quite a powerful message, I think. Okay, let's move on and look at the next one. So the next one is Baha'ism, which is a kind of interesting new religion. It was a new religion in the Victorian era, so it's not that new anymore. But then New Thought was about that old as well. And it, unlike New Thought in the Christian world, it emerged from the Islamic world. The Baha'i religion came out of the Islamic traditions of Iran. And I got into it in some detail because I studied Baha'ism. I've taught its history. It's a very interesting history. It came out of a branch of Sufi Shia Islam in Iran. The Islamic world, as we saw in our course on Islam, split into three main categories. Shia, who followed Ali and Fatima and their descendants, the Imams. And that became the main religion of Iran right up to this day. Unfortunately, the current mullahs that are running Iran, I think, have lost the plot. They don't know what true Shiism is. It's not about repressing women and, all that stuff. It's, on the contrary, it's about loving and appreciating women and men and living in a state of grace and surrender, like that baby I described. But the true Imams know that. And simultaneously there's another branch of Islam, which is Sunni Islam, which was much more strict and more literalistic and less spiritual, less metaphysical, less philosophical. That was associated with Aisha, the last wife of Muhammad, and her father, Abu Bakr, who was really a businessman and a sort of the banker of the movement and became the military leader. And he was the sort of scary banker type that you don't want to go and see, and that became Sunni Islam, which was really a kind of a capitalist military expansionism on the part of the Arabs of that area. Now, I don't believe that was God's number one plan for humanity, was to convert everyone to this thing that meant you do certain rituals at certain times, and then we won't kill you. And to do that conversion by military adventurism. The God that would think that up isn't the God that actually wants us to be as pure and innocent as babies, in my opinion. And that secret was kept in the Shia tradition, although it's tenuous because there were some Shias that didn't live up to it, like the current batch. Although there are great Shia sages around on the planet. Sayyid Hussein Nasr, who I've met, is a great Shia scholar at the moment. Professor Mohammed Rustam, who's Professor of Religious Studies at Carleton University in Canada, who gave a talk about these things recently. He's another great scholar and a friend of Sayyid Hussein Nasr. And together they did a commentary on the Quran that was published called the Study Quran, without knowing that I'd embarked on my own commentary on the Quran a few years prior to theirs. And they both were published more or less at the same time. Mine is an audio commentary. Theirs is a published book. And mine is much, much bigger. If ever it's transcribed, and I hope it will be in my lifetime, it'll be at least 10 or 20 volumes. So it's a much more scholarly, more in-depth, more complex commentary on the Quran. But theirs is absolutely brilliant. So those are some, and he lives in America. Those two, well, Canada and America. Sayyid Hussein Nasr did his PhD at Harvard and has taught history of science there. Now, Baha'ism emerged from the other stream, which was Sufism, which were the true savants who said, look, Muhammad doesn't want us to be this or that. He wants us to find our true self, like the New Thought idea. We have to find the divine mind within us. And we have to go back to the same route that Muhammad himself went to. So there's one of the great quotes by Bayazid al-Bistami, who was a great Sufi early on, who said, once upon a time in the old days, I used to go on pilgrimage on the Hajj to Mecca, and I used to go around the Kaaba 7 times. And then I had a dream the other night, and in the dream, the Kaaba was going around me. Now that's a typically naughty new thought by a Sufi, because that's heretical. God, you're not supposed to dream that kind of thing. But human nature is such that it does. And if you reach a certain pinnacle of consciousness, if you truly let the divine mind into you, and you become as innocent as a child to enable that to happen, and as loving, then the same source that inspired Muhammad or Jesus or whoever will inspire you and come into you. And as long as you're humble and don't get arrogant and go around saying, hey, look at me, I'm great, I'm the new prophet, then then it'll probably still keep descending and being with you. And at that point you become, I think that's the entrance ticket to becoming a philosopher, in my view. Because that's what Plato was saying when we looked at Platonism. And that's Plato in his writings, he described what it's like to be in touch with the divine mind. That's what philosophers do. And then to look at the phenomena of the world through that lens. But it's difficult to stay at that level of intensity all the time, said Plato and his Neoplatonist friends, especially Plotinus, So the Baha'is came from a particular founder called Baha'u'llah, which means the messenger of God, who was a Persian, who lived in the mid-19th century in Persia, and who had experience of what we would call mystical downloads. He became fused with the divine mind, and he believed he was going to be the vehicle of a new revelation to humanity. I mean, he genuinely felt this downrush of divine consciousness, which is a pretty powerful experience, and it enabled him to write some very, very beautiful inspired verses and writings, and to give teachings. And his disciples and followers said, God, you're the new Muhammad, who are you? You're a kind of revelation. Because they'd all been reading the Quran for centuries and not really got very far. And now suddenly there was a new type of thing happening. So, well, I'm just the messenger of God. I'm the Baha'u'llah, he said. And he initiated disciples to go and travel and set up study circles and things. Now the Iranian Empire didn't like this because this was heretical in their view. Sort of ossified Shiism had become stuck in this view that new prophets aren't allowed. There's no possibility of new prophets because Muhammad was the last prophet, and that's become a kind of dogma in both Shiism and Sunni Islam. Now that's a slight problem if you really want to take the New Thought idea that we're all capable of contacting the divine mind seriously. If you take that idea seriously, well then we're in trouble because we're not allowed to, we can't. So what are we supposed to do? Contact the divine mind and then not tell anyone? Just be secret? Would that... So there's a grey area here. It seems to me that there are various ways for an academic to try and explain this. One is that it's to do with the sociology of power and fear. The people who are in charge of Islam at any one point want to block any new prophets coming because that would be a threat to their power base. So if a new prophet suddenly appeared in Iran and said, today, 2023, nearly, and said, okay, I'm the new prophet, I've got the same lineage as Abraham, Moses, Jesus and Muhammad, and I tell you, do not persecute the women. They don't have to wear the hijab. And it's okay, they can go dancing if they want. And stop persecuting gays. And let everyone love each other, be responsible, etc., etc. Came out with a whole new thing. Now that guy would, or woman, if she said, would be ultimately stoned as a heretic. And they would say, no, you can't say that stuff because it's not the way we do things. We do things differently. Women have to do their, they're not allowed. I mean, in Afghanistan, they've now stopped letting women even go to university. I've had some very brilliant Afghan students when I taught at Muslim college, including, women just as clever intellectually as any men I've ever taught. And now the Taliban are saying they can't go to university. I mean, this is showing fear, which is the psychological explanation of fear to stop people learning. So it's the same thing that stops new prophets appearing. And so the Islamic attitude to the Baha'is was, oh no, not on my watch, you can't be a new prophet. Especially because Baha'u'llah was claiming to be a successor to Muhammad. Stop reading just the Quran, read my stuff as well, as a supplementary. And that really annoyed them. So what they did is they banished him from Persia, and they